given the rate of population growth that we're experiencing in Melbourne and the changing preference and acceptance of other forms of housing, for example, townhouses and apartments more so because of affordability and all of this sort of thing, I can see when I look out the window of my office, which is to the side there, it all looks relatively flat at the moment. But over the next 30 years, there will be the equivalent of about 2,500 10 to 12 story apartment buildings built. It will have to happen inevitably, because if we are going to build the Australian economy, as we must do, to look after our ageing population and to do all the other things to make Australia a big and buoyant economy, we must do it on the back of population growth. If we're going to have continued and strong population growth in Melbourne and Sydney, they have to be housed. There are constraints on how that can be done because not everybody can live in a single house on its own block of land. And when you cut all the influences that guide what future development will look like down to what it will have to be, that's where you end up. So the future landscape of Melbourne, which is comparatively flat at the moment, is going to look extraordinarily different in 30 years. In fact, most cities around the world of Melbourne's size have between 30 and 40% of all of their housing stock in the form of apartments. And the average throughout the Western world is about 25% at least. Currently, Melbourne's apartments only contribute 7% of our housing stock. So we are actually the most undersupplied city in the Western world of apartments and other forms of medium density housing. And we're just slow to come around to conforming in that way, because our population growth and the way we live is accelerating and catching up with what is pretty normal now and taken for granted around the rest of the world. I mean, that in itself causes a bit of an anxiety for some people just at the moment, because leaving aside impoverished countries, the main impact of COVID-19 was in those cities that have high density housing where people live in very close quarters. And the reason Australia, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, wasn't hit so hard with that was because we live in a relatively lower density environment altogether. So the question mark emerges, having learned from the pandemic, will we still graduate towards becoming higher rises and greater densities? And I think almost certainly yes, because the need to house doesn't have much choice. And dealing with the pandemic is probably something that we will be able to do via treatment or vaccine. So I would say that the destiny is pretty well set, and certainly in Melbourne and to some degree in Sydney as well, you're going to see a lot more apartments and other forms of affordable and convenient solution to housing, which actually gives the residential markets broadly a lot of underpin. For those that participate in the residential markets as developers or builders, it's a very deep vein of opportunity for decades to come. For those of us that just buy it as our main asset, great. And for those of us that want to invest in it, there's still a lot of opportunity and a lot of underpin there. Yeah.